Yo, yo, yo. What is good, everyone? Hello, and welcome back to another live stream. So, this is Stonks Maxxing day 181, going back to some of the healthcare big pharma stuff we were talking about. This time, gonna go through some flashcards that we have. Let's see if we synced. Okay, nice. So, let's take a look at some healthcare stuff. So, imperfect information on the demand for healthcare. I think this goes back to the idea of what are some of the drivers of demand and supply. In the US, there is a general consensus that there's an over demand and under supply of healthcare products and services. If you think about the demand side, there's a few factors. One of them is imperfect information. Another one is defensive medication. Another one could be preventable diseases. So, going to this idea of imperfect information, what does that actually mean? I would put it as, if you think about how healthcare is paid for today in the US, it's typically a third party. It's the government via Medicare, Medicaid, or it's a private insurance company, United Healthcare, or maybe it's Aetna, Cigna. You get the deal. Because a third party is paying for your medication, your services, typically we don't even think about doing research on what is the most cost effective, what is the most valuable type of product or service to treat our condition or to prevent our condition or to cure it. So that's the idea of imperfect information. There's this incentive misalignment where you don't try to seek out the best possible solution or the most cost-effective solution because you don't really care about what that is because you're not paying for it, essentially. So there's this information imbalance that you're not seeking out. So that's one part of it. I think another part of it is you do have about 15% of the population in the US uninsured. And for those uninsured patients, they can't get turned away from a hospital. So you have the other 85% that has to essentially make up for the loss that the hospital incurs for letting these patients come in and use their services. That could be bore on the 85%, or it could be borne on the government. At the end of the day, the government is the biggest sugar daddy of all, so that's just the way it be. Okay. Yeah. What is the idea of defensive medicine? How does it affect healthcare demand? Yeah, so defensive medicine is related to the concept of limiting liability. So you probably heard of a limited liability corporation, an LLC. I think this does have some similar concepts where a doctor is liable for a patient's life, but doctors make mistakes. And so if they do misdiagnose or mistreat a symptom or a disease, they could be liable if it turns out that it does make the person's condition worse, or hopefully this doesn't happen, but if the patient does die. So what defensive medicine is, it's the idea that doctors will schedule unnecessary, or I shouldn't say unnecessary, but let's say extravagant or an abundant number of tests, number of services, in order to make sure that they are not misdiagnosing a disease. And sometimes a lot of these are unnecessary. There's just extra precautions. And that does create this artificial demand for healthcare. I don't know the exact, it's hard to quantify, it seems like. The book says that's about 200 billion in excess healthcare spending, but I don't know how true that is. Major types of health insurance plans. Okay, so there's kind of two big overarching types, kind of like PB&J, peanut butter and jelly. So the big one is managed care plans, which is kind of like the new age. It's the trendier type of health insurance plan that most companies end up giving their employees. The other type is fee for service. So that was kind of the older indemnity plans that original Medicare was based on, Parts A and B, and what traditional indemnity plans by health insurance companies like Blue Cross, Blue Shield, Cigna. I don't think, maybe there's still some in the world, but it does seem like the world has moved away from fee for service. So I think going into how these actually work, fee for service, it's pretty simple. It's just the idea that whenever you have a service, you go to a healthcare provider, whether it's your primary care doctor or maybe a specialist, your insurance plan is going to help pay for some of it, and you're going to help pay for some of it. So it's kind of split. The percentages is, I guess, different depending on which type of plan you have, but that's just the overarching idea. Both of you guys split the cost, and that cost is split every single time you go to some type of healthcare provider. On the other hand, with managed care, how that typically works is you have this network of doctors. So this kind of limits who you can see, and the coverage is also limited to who is within that network. If you go out of network, typically health insurance plan does not cover any of the costs. But with this, typically the premiums are cheaper, and the cost, or the split, I should say, is more favorable for the patient. So if you think about plans today, Kaiser Permanente, they have a typical health maintenance organization's health insurance plan. I think that's a pretty popular one, and we'll get into this a bit later, but there's three big types of private insurance. I shouldn't say private insurance, but three big types of managed care plans: health maintenance organizations, preferred payer organizations, and point of sale organizations, or I should say point of sale plans. Yeah, you also have United Healthcare. I believe United Healthcare has another type of managed care plan as well. Choice Plus, okay. What are the major types of private insurance plans? So major types of private insurance plans, this goes back to what we were talking about earlier, the health maintenance organization plans, the preferred payer organization plans, the point of sale. So health maintenance organizations, I'd say, is probably the cheapest out of all of them typically when it comes to premiums, but the coverage is really limited, and it's limited to a special network of providers. And typically, with health maintenance organization plans, HMOs, it all centers around a primary care provider, a PCP, which I think is also a type of drug, a narcotic that people get addicted on. But that's beside the point. So all of these center around a PCP, a primary care provider, and this primary care provider will refer you to specialists within the network that are typically covered by your health insurance plan. Second is the preferred payer organization's health insurance plan. And so this one is a bit more flexible compared to the health maintenance organization. You don't necessarily have to have a primary care provider, unlike health maintenance organizations where that's essentially required. And with these preferred provider organizations, the name preferred provider just comes from the idea that it's preferred that you go within the network of providers. These guys will have a cheaper copay or maybe even no copay. They'll typically offer better deals or better prices for patients and maybe for health insurance companies as well. But if you do decide to go off the network, it's still available for you. That's an option. And there still will be some coverage out there, but not as much. And then point of sale, I believe that's a hybrid between the health maintenance organizations and the preferred provider organizations or preferred payer. I keep forgetting the second P in PPO. And so it's a mix. I think it sits right in between. So you do have, I believe, a primary care provider. It still centers around everything, but you could probably get referred to out of network providers. Basically non-existent. Okay, preferred provider organizations. So high level funding story or founding story behind Novo Nordisk. So the founding story behind Novo Nordisk, it does revolve around three main characters. August Hugh and H.C. Hagedorn, they were the original founding members of Nordisk, which was, I'd say, kind of the first Danish insulin pharmaceutical company. And then from that, I believe in 1929 or 1924, the year isn't super clear to me, but Thorvald Peterson actually ended up breaking off of Nordisk, started Novo, and in 1989, both of the companies merged together to form Novo Nordisk. August Crow and H.C. Hagedorn. Thorvald Peterson, 1924. Okay. So it's pretty good. 4.9 trillion healthcare spending in 2023. Year-over-year growth, it's about 7.3%. 7.5%. Yeah. It's a good question, actually. When looking at the healthcare industry in the US, what are the entities that pay for care? So this one is kind of split into two, kind of like PB&J again. There's public payers, private payers. Private is health insurance companies like United Healthcare, like Blue Cross Blue Shield, like Cigna, like Aetna, Humana, all of these guys. You also have individuals, so think of Brian Zhang, which is me. I just paid, I think, $200 or $300 for contacts recently. And then you have the public side, which is, think governments at the federal or even at the state level. What is Ken Fisher believed to be the contributing factor to rising healthcare costs in the US? Think about the supply side. So the contributing factors to rising healthcare costs go back to what we talked about earlier. There's the imbalance in demand and supply. On the supply side, here I believe, and Ken believes, the short-term supply is pretty consistent. It's constrained. And the constraints kind of fall into three different categories. Number one is human capital. With human capital, just think about who actually works in the healthcare industry. The biggest and most important ones are doctors. I shouldn't say the biggest, but the most important ones are typically doctors. These are primary care providers, surgeons, therapists, specialists. These are the guys you go to diagnose your disease and hopefully to treat your disease. But for these guys, it takes them about 10 years of schooling. 4 years of undergrad, 4 years of medical school, 2 years of residency before they even start their job. That 10 years is a really long time, and it takes not only time but also money in order to get to that point. So that's very constrained on the supply side for human capital. When you look at products, so think pharmaceutical drugs, small molecule drugs, biologics, medical devices, those are heavily regulated, take years of research and development, take years of clinical trials to actually go to market. So there's also a time and money aspect constraining the product side. And then finally, you have the distribution. This is the idea of the government regulating prices and insurance companies that have formularies that are used to help patients decide on which type of drug to use based on how much they're covered by the insurance company. An example of a formulary is just a list basically that has different tiers. Typically the lower tiers, so tier 1, tier 2, are the cheapest for the patient, meaning that the healthcare or the health insurance company will cover most of the cost, and then the higher tier are where the health insurance companies do not typically cover as much. And typically the first tier is generic drugs. So just like in clothes, just like in consumer goods, there's brand name drugs that are developed by the likes of Pfizer, Merck, AbbVie, Roche, Eli Lilly, Novo Nordisk. These are the brand name pharma companies that do a lot of the research and development in order to build their brand, in order to be the first mover. And you have the generic drugs, so the Teva Pharmaceuticals, the Chungai Pharmaceuticals, that essentially try to copy the first movers after their patents expire. So these generic drugs are typically on the top of the formulary list because they're the cheapest ones, and they don't have to recoup the costs of R&D and all of the costs spent on clinical trials. So healthcare is a defensive industry. Defense wins championships, right? Defense is the best offense. I think that's what I saw in Pokemon when it was Rampardos versus some other type of Pokemon, Blastoise or something like that. But typical characteristics of a defensive industry. So when we say healthcare is the defensive industry, typically mean that during bear markets, when the market tends to do bad, healthcare performs relatively well compared to other sectors. In bull markets, healthcare performs relatively worse compared to other markets or other sectors. And the typical characteristics, one of the big ones here is elasticity. And specifically, demand and prices, or demand is inelastic when it comes to changes in prices and changes in wages. If you think about healthcare, you think about something that people always need. If you have diabetes, you always need your insulin treatment. If you have cancer, you need to have some type of chemotherapy. You need to get surgery. These are must. If you have a stroke, you need to go to the hospital in order to get cured. So, doesn't matter how much money you have, doesn't matter how much it costs. If you want to live, which I think most people do in this world, hopefully everyone in this world, then you need healthcare. What amount of US GDP was spent on healthcare in 2023? Give a dollar and percent amount. So total US GDP was about, I believe, $23 trillion in 2023. So what percent of that? About 17% of it was spent on healthcare. So that amounts to about $4.9 trillion. 4.9 trillion, okay. idea of recombinant DNA technology. So recombinant DNA technology refers to the idea of identifying a gene and then being able to replicate that gene in order to catalyze some type of chemical response in order to produce a protein of interest or a molecule of interest that can then be used to treat some type of disease. If you think about monoclonal antibodies, so these are antibodies that typically target a single type of antigen and are engineered using recombinant DNA technology. It's a way of constructing a monoclonal antibody. Some common examples, I think, are rituximab, which was an antibody that tried to inhibit the CD20 receptor. I believe for cancerous B cells, I could be wrong, but this is one of the first ever monoclonal antibodies approved by the FDA to treat cancer back in 2000. I think Mylotarg was another one. Mylotarg was an antibody drug conjugate also in 2000. So rituximab was earlier than that, maybe during the 1990s. Yeah. Rituximab approved 1997. Okay. What are the major types of private insurance plans, right? The health maintenance organizations, the preferred provider organizations, point of sale, and maybe some consumer type plan. Health maintenance organizations, those are typically the cheapest. They require a primary care provider. That provider will refer you to specialists within a network of healthcare providers, and typically the copays are cheap, the deductibles may be non-existent, but if you go out of network, then there's basically no coverage. Preferred provider, the name really stems from the idea that it's preferred that you go within the network, but if you do go out of network, see, I got a text. If you do go out of network, there is some coverage, just not as much, and it's typically a bit more expensive compared to light box. That's interesting. Get techno. Major types of private insurance plans. So we left off at preferred provider. So you do go out of network. You can go out of network, but it's preferred you stay in network, right? Point of sale, it's a hybrid between the two. Okay, so that's good for now. Let's go to the life sciences section here. It was published in January 2023 by Nathan Vardy. Yeah. Pharmacyclic's first clinical trial. So that was focused on texafrin, which was a molecule that was designed by Jonathan Sessler, one of the co-founders of Pharmacyclics, or Pharmacyclics. Maybe Pharmacyclics, I don't fully understand how to pronounce it. Yeah, Jonathan Sessler, Richard Miller, they focused on this texafrin molecule to help treat or improve the effects of radiation therapy on tumors and cancers, but didn't really work out. Excitrin, texafrin, excitrin, okay. John Bennett. John Bennett was the scientist that ended up coming with the idea of a magic bullet in order to really start the movement or pioneer the idea of targeting specific indications, receptors, checkpoints that could help treat diseases. And so this led to the idea of chemotherapy, where you can kind of use certain types of molecules, chemicals, in order to block, inhibit cancer cells from binding with helpful natural killer cells or T cells that I guess is a form of immunotherapy as well. Oh shit. Right. Who am I thinking of then? Because I always go one way around. The guy who came up with the magic bullet. Not Sidney Farber. He was the chemotherapy on kids guy. I'll be back in a sec. Okay, I'm gonna do it again. Nathan Vardy. Rudolph Virchow. Okay, Nathan Vardy. So he used to be a managing editor at MarketWatch and senior editor at Forbes. I guess he still is probably right now. Likes to write about private equity, hedge funds, finance, and pharma. Vardy. Right. So Rudolf Virchow, he thought that John Bennett's theory of the separation of blood, if I remember correctly, so we had saw John Bennett, he was call him a doctor, a pathologist in 1845, a physician. And at the time, he had classified leukemia, or a form of leukemia, as a separation of blood. What does separation mean? So that's a medical term used to describe the buildup of pus whenever you have some type of infection. And pus, really, I think it's just dead cells, dead skin, tissue, and also white blood cells forming in a very concentrated part of your body. And leukemia, it causes your blood to become very silky, very white, because it's the abnormal growth of white blood cells in your body. So that's what John Bennett originally thought, but Rudolf Virchow, I think, saw John Bennett's theory, saw it also firsthand with one of his patients, and noticed that, there doesn't seem to be any type of signs for an infection. So that's kind of weird. I don't think John Bennett's theory is 100% correct. He also noticed that the spleen was doing perfectly fine. I guess the spleen is in charge of handling infectious responses. So he looked at different parts of the body and didn't really find anything that showed evidence of an infection. So he ended up coining the term leukemia to describe what the separation of blood really was. Oh, an enlarged spleen. Okay, never mind. So the spleen is right above your stomach, it seems like. Left lobe of liver, pancreas, colon. Okay. Guess if you get punched right in the small intestines, you're fucked. Yeah. Man, this kind of just, at the end of the day, man, humans were just a bunch of skin, some organs, bones. That's it. Damn, dude. Kind of puts things into perspective, honestly. Who was Rudolf Virchow and what was his contribution to oncology? So Rudolf Virchow, I believe he was another physician during that 1800 period. A bit after John Bennett, he was able to coin the term leukemia after he noticed a patient with a similar symptom compared to John Bennett's patient, where he coined the term separation of blood. I think he's probably German. Don't fully remember. Yeah. Rudolf Virchow, German. Okay, so he's a German pathologist. Virchow. Rudolf Virchow. Goat. Okay. How many distinct parts does Emperor of all maladies have? What are the names? Number 1 is of black color without boil. I actually don't remember why it's called that. Number 2, I believe, is either an impatient war or could be something else. I don't fully remember. Number 3, I believe, is will you turn me out if I don't get better? Number 4, prevention is the cure, or maybe a distorted version of oneself. Number 6 is the fruits of long endeavors. Impatient war, okay, prevention, distorted version. Oh, so, okay, I guess that was everything. What is the concept of separation in the medical world? Yeah, so this is going back to what we talked about earlier. Separation is whenever you have a buildup of pus and the body responds to an infection, and pus really is just dead skin cells, tissue, and dead white blood cells, and even white blood cells that are currently active and alive. It's kind of like a war going on in your body. Sidney Farber. So Sidney Farber, he was one of the guys that I got confused with earlier. I think he is really considered to be one of the fathers of chemotherapy. He was a child pathologist, so someone that would try to identify and diagnose diseases in children. But along the way in his career at Massachusetts General Hospital, I forgot the exact time frame, but he ended up trying to discover a treatment for cancer and ended up coming with the idea of chemotherapy. I forgot exactly what the molecule was, but it was something that was helpful in sort of the field of chemotherapy, I believe. Pediatric pathologist for combating leukemia. Okay. Here's Richard Miller. Okay, let me hello. Okay. How much bigger? So I guess this will be the last one for today, and then I might come back and stream a bit later today. Ooh, all right, Micron Technology. Something happened with Micron. I don't know exactly what happened. It's up 4%. All right, I think something happened with tariffs, maybe. I don't know why. CVFC stock. Okay. Still not the greatest. Yeah. All right. So Richard Miller, he was a oncologist at Stanford, physician, and founder of Pharmacyclics in 1991 alongside Jonathan Sessler, helped start IDEC Pharmaceuticals with Ron Levy in 1985. And IDEC Pharmaceuticals, I believe, along with other companies as well. I think like Genentech was one of them. Maybe Pfizer as well. I'm not entirely sure. Helped create the first ever approved monoclonal antibody rituximab. Okay. Rituximab, the first monoclonal antibody approved. Oh wow. Oh, approved for the treatment of lymphoma. So I guess that is a key distinction that I had not been making. Cancer. Okay, so first monoclonal antibody used to treat cancer, and it was Roche. Okay. Leading researcher in blood cancer, right? Texafrin. Texafrin. It's Phrine. Okay. John Bennett. So who's the magic bullet guy? Paul Ehrlich. Got it. So with that, going to call this one a good stream, and then I'll call you guys, or I'll do one later today. All right, peace.